introduce this session on multi-domain translation. This session stems from a European project in which we three are currently involved that explores medical translation in the context of biotechnology and genomics. So how a range of actors, biologists, computational people, medics and policymakers jointly try to find application to data, in this case biological data, and more generally to their research findings, applications to healthcare in this case. We come from different backgrounds. James, one of the research fellows in the project, is probably closer to philosophy of science. I am a historian of science. And Mark, a research assistant in the project, is more a quantitative social scientist. And one thing that strikes us is that a common concern in all these disciplines, philosophy, history of science, social science, and I would say also to innovation studies, is the rejection of a linear model, whatever it is. So the rebuttal of the claim that translation is a straightforward linear process from bench to bedside or from the laboratory to the market, but the responses that all those disciplines provide to this question of what translation is or why translation is not a linear process are very different and very diverse. So probably our ambition with this session was to create a framework or just a very minimal common ground in which all these disciplines, innovation studies, history, philosophy of science, quantitative and qualitative social sciences, can commonly talk and start a dialogue about what translation is and what translation isn't, and also more generally a dialogue of how to use and how to make sense of data, and that would probably connect to our previous panel. So we originally had 3 speakers. Unfortunately, Bruce has to cancel in last minute due to health reasons. He's unwell this morning. So we will start with James Lowe, whom, as I said, is a research fellow in this project on medical translation in the history of genomics, and he's going to speak about translation in the context of animal genomics and more generally the Pig Genome Project. So, hold your theme.
So as we all mentioned, I'm working on the Transgene project, and I do just want to start by acknowledging the support of the European Research Council and the Horizon 2020 programme, which funds the Transgene programme, and also thank everyone who's been involved in organising and running this event. So the Transgene project is obviously interested in the relation of genomic sequencing to medical translation. Now my focus is on the sequencing of pig genome, or sequencing more broadly of pigs. And one of the interesting things that arises from that is one of the main domains of translation in the pig genetics community, pig genomics community, concerns the relation of the research outputs to outcomes for the livestock breeding industry. And that's something that Anne was going to talk about today. Obviously, as she's not here, I will pick up a bit more on what exactly the involvement of pig genetics and genomics is on in livestock breeding industry. And one of the interesting things is relating that area of translation, although one of the interesting things is the people in the pig genetics community don't necessarily understand it as such, to a different form of translation, i.e. medical translation, and that's led to me sort of thinking about tentatively proposing a difference between a single domain translation, whereby there is a single or a set of relatively stable set of actors working towards a single type of output, and this output need not necessarily just be completely involving one aim, but it can involve multiple aims. So for instance, with medical translation, there will be 2 intimately associated aims of, first of all, sort of improving therapeutics for human health, but also actually improving the bottom line of pharmaceutical companies. The multi-domain translation, on the other hand, is where you may have one or more research communities, and I'll describe the one in the pig genetics community, that may relate to very different kinds of outputs and very different kinds of sets of aims, and very different kinds of industries and sets of actors. And I'm going to tentatively propose that thinking that there are areas of research that can be characterised better as multi-domain translation than the more traditionally conceived single-domain translation. And this builds upon, as Miguel pointed out, some of the critiques of linearity, but also more accounts in STS that stress, the embeddedness of translational research in various institutional frameworks, but also how it is intimately associated with practices of valuation. So to that end, I just sort of briefly outline the problem of translation as it has been conceived, mainly in the biomedical medical context. New modes of translational research which are characterised by this multi-domain label that I've provided, and then actually outlining the challenge of multi-domain translation, partly for the actual genetics community themselves, but also more broadly people for scholarly communities such as ours. And I come to this really sort of as a challenge and an invitation, really, from somebody of more of a history of philosophy of the life sciences background to people who are more engaged, more strictly speaking, with innovation studies. So the problem of translation has been traditionally conceived in terms of biomedical research, the bench to bedside gap. So there's language of gaps, obstacles, and in this famous cartoon from Nature, the valley of death between the kind of laboratory research and the actual outcomes in the clinic. So a typical case is that Miguel's been researching is the sequence data associated with the Human Genome Project. And a lot of the advent of this kind of translational research paradigm has come partly as a result of politics and funding to do with the National Institutes of Health, having received a massive influx of funding, and then a retrenchment of funding, and also concerns about the efficacy of cancer research. And another part of this is, of course, the concern with pipelines of new drugs in the pharmaceutical industry as well. So there's been rhetorics of pathways, alignments and stages, as exemplified by this diagram that I obtained from the Medical Research Council website, but also an emphasis on networks, interaction, coordination and interfaces. So this is a quote by Sir Tom Blundell, who was the Director General of first of the Agricultural and Food Research Council, then the first Chief Executive of the Biotechnology and Biological Sciences Research Council, and then the Chair of that organisation. And this is what he was saying about the importance of a continuous interface in his sort of parliamentary interview for that latter post. And there's parallels here with Calonne's more sociological account of translation as well, and exploring some of these parallels between the use of the term translation in the social sciences and in natural sciences and policy has been an interest of our group. So the problem of translation has been conceived in the sphere of biomedical research in terms of the production of knowledge relevant to the development of therapeutic interventions and decision-making concerning them. So this would be, say, within a pharmaceutical industry, they want to improve the quality of their evidence to maybe improve the quality of their decision-making concerning which candidate drugs to proceed through the pipeline and which to cut off. And as a result of this, there's been extensive efforts to reconfigure funding, organisation, geography, built environment, methodology of scientific research. So the sort of external and internal obstacles as they've been conceived. And one of the examples of this, for example, in the United States, has been the founding of this National Centre for Advancing Translational Sciences within the National Institutes of Health. So here there's the singular goal of translation that's unquestioned, improving the productivity and efficiency of research outputs to health outcomes. Outside of that domain of biomedical research, I come to the example of pig genetics and breeding. So here you've got, again, a commonly agreed aim of improving the production traits of animals in the breeding industries and obviously for livestock production. There has historically been a very close working relationship between publicly funded institutes examining animal genetics, animal science, and livestock breeding industry. And in the case of the pig industry, there is a very large breeding industry sector, which is separate from the actual livestock production, which has been intimately associated with a very small number of large companies, about sort of 4 or 5 major ones, associated with a relatively small number of departments and institutes. So these include, 2 in particular institutes, organisations owned and operated by the United States Department of Agriculture, the French National Research Institute for Agriculture, the old institutes that were previously funded by the now defunct Agricultural and Food Research Council, which includes just a couple of miles to the west, what is now the Roslin Institute, land-grant universities in the United States such as Iowa State University, and specialist agricultural universities, for example, some of the more prominent ones in the Netherlands, Denmark and Sweden. There are other actors across Europe, but there's a small number of departments. It's a very tight-knit community, and there's a lot of traffic between industry and the publicly funded research institutes. The publicly funded research institutes and departments will often train the people at PhD level who will go on to work in the industry. There's also constant traffic of people coming from industry on secondment into these institutes to pursue particular projects, which for these institutes is good for, it's perceived as good for them because it's providing resources, but also it's a central part of their scientific output, but obviously it's benefiting the people from industry and the industries themselves as well. So one of the key aspects is the actual discipline of a lot of livestock genetics has grown up intimately with the concerns of industry, and in many ways the discipline is itself inherently translational. And one of the other interesting aspects of it, no, I won't cover that just now. So this is conceived as strategic but pre-competitive research. This is why a lot of the industry is very interested in, is quite happy to collaborate, even on joint projects involving other companies with these publicly funded research institutes. And the product of the outputs of this are basically the improvement of production traits. So these private companies have very large, well-characterised genetically and phenotypically herds. They have a great deal of data on it, and the publicly funded research institutes will often use the herds owned by the private companies because it's simply not economical for the publicly funded research institutes to maintain large herds of animals. And one of the things that they conceive of as their role, many of these institutions listed here, is the production of tools. And those tools are things that can be used by the breeding industry to, say, improve certain production traits like reducing back fat, increasing fecundity and so forth. And some of these tools can include the development of chips to rapidly genotype animals, historically the production of maps of genes and gene markers, and obviously ultimately the sequencing of the pig genome as well. And the uses to which these maps and sequences and chips, including single nucleotide polymorphisms, single changes to individual loci in the genome, has been improvement in these production traits by various means, more sort of traditional breeding methods, marker-assisted selection, where they identify gene markers that are closely associated with particular areas in the genome that are associated with changes in these production traits, and now moving more into sort of genomic selection, incorporating data on a large number of markers across the genome, and also, including at Roslin just over there, genome editing now of livestock animals. So there's been an close and intimate relationship between these with actual clear, evident effect and impact on the desired aims of both the publicly funded research institutes and industry. However, as a result of changes to other industries and as a result of changes also to, say, the funding arrangements of these publicly funded research institutes, they are now broadening out. I mean, it's an uneven picture. They are broadening out the potential uses of their own research outputs to other areas of endeavour and industry. And I characterise these as different domains of translation. So you may have the same group in the same institute now involved in translational processes of a very different kind. So not just the example of the livestock industry breeding to improve production traits, but other aims as well. So improving the pig as an animal model for preclinical research, including toxicology testing is another area. Xenotransplantation, so one of the key overlaps between, well, this is a separate domain of research in itself, but there were key overlaps with many of the people working in the livestock industry, because there were concerns, certainly in the 1990s, of retroviruses, or porcine endoretroviruses, or PERVs as they completely straight-facedly call them, which integrate themselves into immune areas of the, well, so the swine leukocyte antigen area, the areas of the pig genome that are associated with immune response. And there was a great deal of genetic and genomic work that went on to try and actually identify the scale of the threat from these retroviruses and whether they would actually cause a harm to human health if, say, an organ was transplanted from a pig into a human. And increasingly, a lot of work is being done in collaboration with industries associated with animal health and nutrition. So this includes veterinary medicine, but it also includes the animal feed industry, and it includes also concern with animals, the nutritional quality of animals in terms of how that affects the humans who consume them. So there's a multiple number of areas now in which these institutions that have previously been intimately associated with just the livestock breeding industry are now dealing with all kinds of other industries, all different other kinds of actors for different kinds of projected or desired outcomes. Oh, sorry. Right. So I think what you've got here is you've got a problem of multi-domain translation, and I think this is what you see in the single domain translation and all the literature, for instance, on translation in the medical and biomedical spheres is quite how difficult it is to reconfigure research, either internally in terms of the methodology of the research or externally in terms of how you actually create these interfaces and networks between people, for example, working in the laboratory and people working in clinical research or people working in the pharmaceutical industry. So I would suggest, and it is a mere suggestion, that when you actually look at this multi-domain translation, you have quite another order of magnitude of difficulty and complexity, in addition to perhaps emerging new issues. You find that they need to actually behave in the way that the sort of weird adherents of the many-faced god in Game of Thrones have to behave. They have to be able to actually wear and inhabit many faces and engage in many different interfaces with different actors and industries at the same time. And the problem with this is, if you've got a situation where you have been associated with a single domain translation with quite a deep historical entanglement, is you're now dealing with different communities that have different conceptions of how to actually collaborate with publicly funded researchers, of how you actually produce, integrate and share data in various ways, and different engagements with genetics and genetic research as well, because the livestock breeding industry, certainly for pigs, it's not necessarily the same for other livestock animals, has always had, well, certainly since the 1960s, a deep engagement with livestock genetics and increasingly in the last 10 years or so with genomics. Not all of these other industries have had much to do with genetics or genomics. And so you have different historical entanglements, different understandings of the way collaborations and research should take place. So different levels of problems that present themselves in the single domain translation. So the challenge for the researchers is how do they actually embark on translational research when they're engaged with, at the same time, multiple actors from multiple industries and other communities that have different ends in mind, as well as different conceptions of collaborative research and the role of genetics and other areas of scientific research, and how they actually operate with these many interfaces or faces. And of course there's also different models of private sector organisation and the histories and geographically, the industries are actually organised in different ways in different parts of the world. But now I sort of conclude on what the challenge is for HPS people and science technology studies and innovation studies people, is that how we actually engage methodologically, analytically, theoretically with these multiply overlapping, or sometimes partially overlapping, domains of potential translation. And how do we actually engage with this in areas outside of the medical sphere where they don't actually necessarily understand themselves as working translationally. And they've not engaged with this translational research paradigm in the way that people in the biomedical research sphere have. And what implications this has more broadly for the concept of translational research and associated practices and institutional arrangements. And I have a couple of, few tentative suggestions of the ways we can engage with this challenge. And these are just a few. I'd welcome any more, and I'd welcome any comment on some of these. So one is obviously an examination of industry structures and cultures. And I think one approach that seems to make most sense to me is to really examine the forms of collaboration and interaction. To form sort of taxonomies and characterizations of different ways in which these kinds of research collaborations can take place. Another is through the concept of data journeys, which has been proposed by Sabina Leonelli. And this really looks at data as something that needs to be packaged for travel. It's not something that data cannot just merely be produced and then used. It has to be packaged to be able to travel, to be able to be used and integrated potentially in a range of different contexts. Varipraxis is a term that I've actually coined myself, and it concerns the way that actors actually are able to apprehend, identify, measure, compare, basically data that varies. So by variation I understand things that the differences that can be measured or are measurable in particular parameters for defined types of things. I'll be happy to go into that more, but I would propose that one of the issues in translational research is actually the alignment of different regimes of varipraxis, of ways of engaging with variation. And particularly true, I think, when you look at the life sciences, that variation is absolutely constitutive of everything that is being investigated. Intermodality is a concept from transport management, the idea being of moving passengers from one mode of transport to another. There are problems with it in the sense that, throughout this process, the passenger, the unit of transference, actually remains unchanged, which is not the case when you're looking at some of these translational processes. But it is it is something that concerns large-scale infrastructures, and as such, I sort of propose it as something that there might be sort of innovation studies or STS people that might be able to sort of engage with it, and that sort of form a potential point of collaboration between sort of my concerns and theirs. The idea of thought collectives in the work of Ludwig Fleck, the idea that there's people can belong to more than one thought collective, which is a way of actually it's a way of thinking and doing. The term thought is a bit misleading. You can belong to more than one circle, and also you can belong to different parts of the circle, the more esoteric inner circle or the more exoteric outer circle, and the ways in which you can actually interact with different thought collectives and different people who may belong to different combinations of thought collectives may be quite productive. And finally, there's obviously the potential for quantitative approaches, and obviously Mark will be dealing with that after some questioning. So thanks very much for listening, and I welcome any comments or questions.